I want to talk about NPCs. And I've struggled coming up with a good kickoff for this video, so I'm just going to cut to the point. When I run a tabletop RPG, I want it to be a great game. I want my players to love it. I want to love it. I want it to be a good time for all involved. But the problem is, I'm not that good of a GM. But I want to be. And to become a better GM, my plan is to make every session I run just a little bit better than the last one. So I'm always looking for ways to improve my games and myself as a GM. I want my players to be invested and immersed and excited for every session to come. And so when that does happen, when I get those amazing moments after the session, I analyze the scenes that I've been the happiest with. And while evaluating them, I think I want every scene to be as good as this scene was. So what made it so good? And the most common thing in all the best scenes I've done is the drama. My players were making choices and taking actions that mattered, doing things that changed the game. And the second most common thing is the NPCs in the scenes. They mattered. They were memorable. They invoked a tangible response from my players. They had presence in the game. The drama and the choices that made the scene so good were often the players responding to or interacting with these NPCs. Which boiled down means for my games to be good, they need good NPCs. Great NPCs. So I need to be able to make a readily available supply of great NPCs, which I also determined was easier said than done. But I've been working on ways to do this for a few years now, and in that time I've developed 3 successful techniques I now use in every game I run. NPCs are worthless until they are not. Maybe a weird statement, but it's become a very solid mantra for me. It came about after noticing that NPCs that I had created were often failing to have the impact I was aiming for. I was trying to build valuable and interesting NPCs right out of the box. When I needed an NPC, I would sit down and I would start coming up with all these ideas I thought were cool. I would try to build NPCs I thought the players would like or find interesting. I would try to build bad guys I thought the players would fear or hate or both. I would imagine all these interesting scenarios and interactions the PCs and the NPCs might have together. And then the NPCs, they would be unleashed into my games and I would have really mixed success doing things this way. Sometimes they would land and I would be happy with the outcome, but this was definitely a rarity. Often I would get the opposite outcome, where an NPC that I'd hoped they would care about, they ended up hating, or an NPC they were supposed to be opposed to, they ended up being the one they liked the most. Or maybe I would try for an intimidating bad guy that would be in the game for like 10 seconds before they became the butt of some player's joke, and they were never taken seriously after that. Or, worst of all, they would enter the game and just kind of nothing all over the place. Players wouldn't really remember their name and they would kind of just end up being forgotten about. 2 sessions later, some player would be like, hey, maybe we should ask that wizard guy from back at the place about this. And the other players would be like, which wizard guy? What's his name? Just a complete airball of an NPC. And I realized I was approaching NPCs the wrong way around. When I GM, I'm not writing a book. I can't force scenarios and outcomes without hurting the game. My PCs are the most important part of the game world, and they are also a massive random element largely out of my control. So making plans for my sessions or plots based on my players thinking, interacting, or feeling a certain way about NPCs was a suboptimal approach. It was gambling. I could stack the odds, sure, but I was still doomed to fail more often than I succeeded. Now, rather than making NPCs of value, I try to grow them. I make fresh NPCs, and they go into the game very raw, with zero value or expectations. When I create NPCs now, I give them very few details, and every detail I do give them, I want to get the most value out of, mainly because I'm lazy. So, how would I approach creating a new NPC? I start with a name, which would sometimes get used, sometimes it gets thrown away. I often come up with names on the spot, but it's good to have one on hand in case I can't come up with something. So, as an example, I might put down the name Emmett. Next up, I would give the NPC what I call a descriptor, which is basically a key descriptive feature about their appearance. Now, the descriptor has a very important job. It acts as a sort of mental cue, a sticking point, or a memory tool, if you will, to help both the players and I as the GM to remember the NPC. Let's say Emmett's descriptor is burn scars across the right side of their face. During the first encounter with Emmett, I would make sure to use his descriptor while describing them. Then, if and when Emmett turns up again later in the session or maybe in subsequent sessions, I would work the descriptor early into the interactions with the PC. It only has to be something simple like Emmett scowls in frustration and rubs the burn scars on his face as you enter the room. But it's amazing how picking a simple descriptor and making use of it in every encounter with an NPC will not only help you remember your NPCs and get quickly into their mindset, but it also helps the players remember them. It's like an associative memory exercise kind of thing. If you've ever had your players say something along the lines of, "Who was this guy again?" when an NPC turns up in your games for a second time, well, since adopting this trick, I've found that it happens a hell of a lot less. Further to this, at the top of my notes for my NPCs, right under Emmett's name would be descriptor, burn scars, right side of face. So if I have to go scrabbling to my notes to quickly refresh myself on an NPC mid-session, the first thing I see about them is a prompt to help me and the players recall who they are. Descriptors should be the main focal feature of an NPC's appearance, generally something exclusive to them. It could be long flaming red hair or a jewel-encrusted eye patch or a tiger tattoo across their broad shoulders. Whatever it is, it should be a thing that someone would first notice when meeting in this NPC, even without direct interactions. So that's the descriptor. But there's another key bit of information I give my NPCs during creation, and that is a quirk. And the quirk is a sly little trick to make the NPCs feel like real people with minimal effort. Making my NPCs feel real is something I always aim to do, but keeping track of a complete backstory for every zero-value NPC is way too much work. So the aim of the quirk is to make them seem more real and sort of three-dimensional until the NPC either gains more value or disappears from the game. Whereas the descriptor is obvious and it should be the first thing the PC spots an NPC, the quirks are usually less important in the grand scheme of things, and they tend to only appear during direct interactions. They are there to add depth without requiring the PCs to deep dive into the NPC's backstory. The goal is to fuel immersion. I want the NPC to appear like it has existed in the world prior to the PC's first encounter with them. I want the players to get the feeling that the NPC has things going on with them that aren't directly related either to the PCs or to the current situation they are in. For Emmett, I might put down that his quirk is he hates when people stand behind him. Now, where the descriptor I make sure to work quickly into every encounter with the NPC, the quirk, I'm keen to get it into the first encounter with the PCs if I can. Then I aim to get it into every encounter past that where it's possible. But if it doesn't make it in every time, it's not the end of the world. I don't bother trying to explain the history or the origin of the quirk. Most of the time my PCs won't bother drilling into it too far. But as the game goes on, if the NPC gains value, it can be expanded on however I like. When I use the NPC quirk, it's just to flavour a scene. Something like, Emmett looks uncomfortable with you standing behind him and shifts position before saying. The little bit extra the quirk gives makes the interaction and Emmett seem more real than just a direct response from the NPC. And the depth the quirk adds will compound as it's used more and more and the pattern develops. I avoid making the quirks a key factor about the NPC in their first scene, or really any other scene I put them in. I don't want the first meeting of an NPC with claustrophobia quirk to be set in a small cave everyone is stuck in, because that quirk will dominate the scene and their interactions with the PCs. The quirk is just extra spice for the game. If the PCs make use of a quirk for an advantage with the NPCs, good. Let them have it. It means they're paying attention and reward them for that. But for me as a GM, the quirk is about adding depth without adding a truckload more work. I've come up with all kinds of quirks over the years, NPCs that will always say a person's name in every time they talk to them, NPCs that hate getting wet, ones that won't drink or are always looking for a drink but won't drink alone. Maybe they put on gloves whenever they're outside or will try and leave any place where a guard enters. Maybe they squint every time they look at something or try to read it. Whatever. Quirks are a pattern of behaviour with an NPC. They are a little chunk of personality that can be quickly and repeatably be deployed by the GM without requiring the memorization of a backstory. Lazy but effective depth. Okay, so that's how I create my NPCs. Generally, that's all the information I'll come up with them before they enter the game. I like to have about 10 or so of these fresh, unused NPCs set up and ready to go before any session, cause I never really know when I might need one. The only time I will add any more information than this at creation of a fresh NPC is because they have a very specific purpose to serve in the upcoming session, and all the extra information I give them is based around serving that purpose. Like if they are a guard, maybe I will note their rank, or if they're a politician, maybe I will note down who they represent or their core affiliations. But even that additional information I will keep as light as I can. So now that I have created my zero value NPCs, unvalued and with no real expectations for them, how do I make them good? How do I add value to them? Reuse, reuse, reuse. The best way I have found to build drama in my games is through relationships. Without an existing relationships, characters, NPCs or PCs, are very two-dimensional to each other. A face, possibly a name, a first impression, that's it. For there to be more weight to two characters interacting, there needs to be a relationship of any sort between them. Good, bad, or otherwise, as long as it's there. And the only way to get a relationship between PC and NPC, or even a PC and a PC, is history. The PC and the NPC, they must have spent time together in the game interacting with each other to build that history. They need to have formed opinions of each other and have shared experiences. And before we go any further, I don't count pre-written histories or backstories as interactions. Yeah, they sound nice and it can colour that first interaction, but pre-written backstories is kind of like somebody else's history more than the actual characters because it all happened off screen. And you can argue this point, but I have found that it never carries the same weight as history created in the game. If the PC makes an active effort to bring that pre-written history into the game, then cool, work with it. It gets value now from becoming part of the actual game, more so than the fact it was written down beforehand. But anyway, moving on. PCs and NPCs have to spend time interacting in the game to build that history, but it can be especially hard for antagonists because it's fairly common in a lot of games that once the PCs have flagged an NPC as a bad guy, or worse, the bad guy, they do whatever they can to kill them as soon as possible. Especially in games like D&D, the tunnel vision sets in, he's a bad guy, I have all these combat abilities, killing him is my best route forward. And this makes it very hard to build any history or good drama in a scene because the only interaction is maybe a brief verbal exchange and then a fight scene. The PCs are unlikely to feel conflicted about their actions. They are unlikely to even give it any second thought because to them, the antagonist was little more than a coloured target from an arcade game like Point Blank, just there to be shot. And this is where the techniques in this video were birthed from. The fundamental idea I built off is that the best bad guys don't start as bad guys, they just start as NPCs. And to take these zero value NPCs and turn them into the best bad guys, I make use of the reuse, reuse, reuse technique. So, once I'm past session 1, I should have a handful of NPCs that have already appeared in the game, interacted with the PCs, and most importantly, aren't dead. Any NPCs that fall into this category, I like to say, are in my stable of NPCs. Now, when I'm coming up with an encounter, whether this is something I'm doing in pre-prep between sessions or coming up with something on the fly during a session, if I need an NPC, rather than creating a new NPC to perfectly suit the situation, instead I can go back through my stable of NPCs and see if there is one there that can be reused in this situation. It can be any NPC that I have used before that has interacted with the PCs, even better if the PCs know that NPC's name. And that's all that's required of an NPC to be suitable for reuse. If I can come up with a somewhat plausible explanation or reason why the NPC can serve the purpose I need it to serve in this scenario, then I generally say, go for it. And here's an example. I've come up with a quest where a miner needs rescuing from a nearby mine that's been overrun by monsters, something straightforward like that. Somewhat instinctively, I might go to create a sort of quest giver NPC to get the players involved in the plot. Maybe a family member or a concerned friend of the miner or the owner of the mine, whatever. But instead of adding a new NPC, I go back over the ones I've already used and see if there is a suitable one. Maybe a couple of sessions back, when the PCs were entering the city, they were hassled by a guard officer at the city gate. It may have only been a brief interaction, but they learned his name was Captain Emmett. He had burn scars across the right side of his face. He gave them a hard time about all their weapons and told them to stay out of trouble. He also charged them a city entry tax, which they're pretty sure isn't actually a thing. So rather than going for a fresh NPC, I can use Captain Emmett, deciding he's now the miner's brother. And by using an existing NPC rather than a fresh one, this should build on the history between the NPC and the characters. Best of all, it also colours the start of this quest, this story, in a way that a fresh NPC was unlikely to do. Maybe the PCs decide to bleed Captain Emmett for as much money as they can because he was a jerk to them, or maybe they decide to get over their previous grievances because being owed a favour by the Captain of the Guard would be worth it. Or maybe they just tell Captain Emmett to take a running jump, they leave his brother to his fate and head off on their way. It does not matter. As long as the players and Captain Emmett are alive at the end of the session, there is more history now, built on from previous sessions. The relationship is growing, and it is something you can continue to grow and leverage in future sessions. Suddenly, I have an NPC of value in my stable. Not much value, but value nonetheless. And I want to keep adding value to Captain Emmett, but I also want to cultivate more valuable NPCs as the game goes along. So for myself, as a rule of thumb, every session I want to try and reuse at least 2 or so NPCs from my stable. But I also want to add at least 2 brand new NPCs into the game and get them in front of the PCs, let the PCs learn their name and hear their descriptors, and hopefully their quirks. As a GM, I find it's best to work with the understanding that any NPC could die at any time, so I always want to keep a bunch of irons in the fire, never putting all my hopes in a single NPC doing what I need, cause with that kind of mindset, you either end up in trouble when they die, or you start fudging things to keep them alive. And I have found if the players pick up on the GM fudging things to keep an NPC in the game, it can devalue that NPC. They start being viewed as protected, often suddenly becoming less real to the players. And if your only high-value NPC bites the dust mid-game, you don't want to be back to square one. So, Technique 1 taught us to make NPCs to feed into our stable. The descriptors give us a handy tool to help the players and the GM remember them. The quirk gives us a jumping off tool to start adding depth. And Technique 2 has us adding value to the NPCs in our stable. And as the game goes on, we want to keep feeding NPCs into the stable and we want to keep spreading the value around. I try to have a good dozen NPCs that are growing in value or on the go at all times because you never know when one might eat it. But to make great NPCs, really high value NPCs which you can build some really good drama out of, for that I have one more technique. Observe and reassess. There's a potential pitfall you can stumble into as you're adding value to your NPCs, and I call this the black and white problem. And the black and white problem is where an NPC of value ends up in one of 2 positions. Position 1, which I'll call white, is where the players see the NPC as being good and wise and without fault. And when NPCs like this give the players an instruction or advice, they will be happy to follow it without question because that NPC is good and smart, so doing what they want must also be good and smart. Then opposed to that is the black position, where an NPC is not trustworthy. The PCs believe everything they do is either foolish or purposely deceitful or outright evil, and everything the NPC does should be opposed because they are bad, so the things they want are bad. I don't much like either of these positions because they undermine player choice. It's almost becomes a video game-like with NPCs in these positions. My players tend to turn their brains off like it's a dialogue choice from a Mass Effect game where one option is clearly marked as the heroic one and one is marked as, I'm not sure what the red choices were in Mass Effect, whether they mean choice, it doesn't matter. Still, the players can go, I don't need to think about my actions here. This NPC always guides me to the heroic outcome, and I want to be heroic, so I should just do as they say. Not what I want at all. Drama is all about choice and the ramification of those choices. Where I want most of my high value NPCs to sit is in the grey area between. They can be lighter grey, they can be darker grey, both are good. The main aim is to keep them out of the extremes. I don't want my NPCs to seem infallible or perfect, at least not for long. I want the players to think about their interactions and weigh the consequences of their choices. So to combat this, I implement technique 3, and I start with observe. Observe is nice and simple in that when my players interact with an NPC or speak about them, I observe and note how they feel towards them. Let's return to Captain Emmett. Their first encounter with him was mainly a negative one. He talked down to them and when they tried to enter the city, and he shook them down for coin. And while they agreed to rescue his brother, they made sure to milk him for every coin they could. And while watching this as a GM, I could pretty quickly pick up that the players disliked Emmett. Emmett is a higher value NPC now. He's had 2 appearances in the game. The players are starting to remember the burn scars and they know his brother who they rescued. And their general attitude towards him is negative. They don't like him, but they haven't killed him so far, so that's good. I can leverage that. Maybe I can use Emmett as a minor bully later on, or maybe even a major antagonist, but I have to be careful, because the more their dislike for Emmett grows, the easier it will be for Emmett to be tagged as a bad guy, and then killing is often not far away. And this is where the second part of the technique comes in: reassess. Between sessions, I want to reassess where all my stable of NPCs are sitting in the game, especially the ones I used in the last session. When I reassess, if I have plot ideas for my games, I can start looking at which NPCs could possibly be used to fill key roles. Also, if there have been interesting encounters between the PCs and certain NPCs, and stories are starting to form that can be built upon, I can start looking at potential plots to be based from there. But also, if I have NPCs I'm worried about, I'm worried they're slipping into a black or white position, I can start coming up with ways to move them back into the grey. Continuing with the Emmett example, the PCs don't like him, and with each encounter their disdain seems to grow. I'm enjoying their interactions with Emmett, and they are getting good history going, so I don't want Emmett to end up as a target. So what I start looking for is ways to add redeeming points to the history between Emmett and the PCs, something to lighten the grey. Maybe in a session or 2, the players are in a desperate fight in the city, they are outnumbered by raiders and things are looking bad. I can have Emmett and his squad come charging into the fight, evening out the numbers and letting the PCs get things back under control. The relationship between Emmett and the PCs doesn't have to go instantly rosy. Maybe after the fighting dies down, Captain Emmett pulls off his helmet from his head and wipes the sweat from his burn-scarred brow and scowls and says, "I don't like you adventuring types, you're always trouble, but you're a darn sight better than raider scum." The PCs are unlikely to suddenly love Captain Emmett, but if I'm lucky, they might start viewing him differently. He's still a jerk, but at least when there's real guard work to be done, they know he doesn't shy away, so it changes the relationship. And even better, it complicates it, and complications are awesome. Emmett has once again grown in value. The PC's opinion of Emmett has also grown and matured, and this can be leveraged on in future sessions. Maybe as the game goes on, Emmett grows into a begrudging ally, fighting back to back with the PCs during the 20-day war. Maybe Emmett's bad habits get the best of him, and he becomes a ruthless chief of the guards who terrorizes the people of the city and needs to be disposed of, but the players failed to act on it earlier because they thought he had some honor. Maybe Emmett just ends up being a familiar face whenever the players return to the city. Whatever. Emmett is now a good value NPC. He has a history with the PCs and their relationship is complicated. Emmett is now a useful tool I can use in my game as needed. And from NPCs like this, we get good depth and good drama in our games. If Emmett needs to be helped, the shared history might bring the PCs to pause. If Emmett needs to be killed, the shared history might bring the PCs to pause. That pause is the seed from where the drama is grown. The pause is the players remembering. It's them evaluating. It's them considering. So on that, I think you should aim for a complicated relationship between most of your NPCs and the PCs. If you have an NPC that has fallen far into the white position, have them do something to tarnish their pure reputation with the PCs. Maybe the noble and good leader of the people is okay with others suffering as long as his people survive. Maybe they act out of lust or envy or hate. It doesn't mean that the NPC can't be generally good. They just need to be flawed, even just a little. Their intentions may still be pure, but their choices can be poor. I want drama in my games. I want depth. I want my games and the worlds they exist in to feel real. And for that, I need my NPCs to carry weight in the game. They need to be important. They need to make an impact. Some of them need to be almost as impactful in the game as the PCs are. But I think the key thing to remember as a GM is I can't really decide which NPCs are important. The PCs are the game, and they are the ones who decide which NPCs matter to them. As the GM, I can stack the odds, but if I force it, more than not, the outcome will be underwhelming. Drama comes not only from actions, but the history that complicates those actions. The depth in the world becomes much more apparent when an NPC dies and everyone at the table can see that history they've built die along with them. So, build your zero value NPCs and keep putting them into your games. Give them a descriptor and make sure to use it. Sprinkle a quirk in when you can too. The NPCs that survive, bring them back, time and time again. Every NPC shouldn't be in every session, but if you haven't seen a particular NPC of value in a few sessions, try to work them into the next one. Observe and reassess the growing history and relationship between your PCs and your NPCs. Build on it. Keep your NPCs in the grey zones when you can, and build on the stories that come from these interactions. See where they go. But if it's time for one of your valued NPCs to become the bad guy, don't be afraid to let them slip into the black. The history is there now. Leverage the hell out of it.